The man stood still, not because he wanted to, but because his legs wouldn't move fast enough. One foot dragged slightly as he tried to step back. 5 teenagers closed in, forming a loose circle around him. Too close. Way too close. "Come on," one of them said, laughing. "Why are you shaking like that?" The man didn't answer. He kept his eyes down, gripping the handle of his walking cane a little tighter than before. People were nearby. A few feet away. Close enough to hear everything. But no one stepped in. Another teenager moved closer, waving a hand in front of the man's face. "Look at him," he said. "He can't even run." Laughter erupted. The man took a slow breath and finally spoke. "Please," he said quietly. "I don't want trouble." That only made it worse. One of them shoved his shoulder, not hard enough to knock him down, just enough to show they could. The man stumbled, barely catching himself. A phone camera went up. "Bro, this is gold," someone muttered. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Eyes glanced away. Someone pretended to check their phone. Someone else took a step back. Still, no one intervened. The teenagers sensed it instantly. That silence. That permission. One of them leaned in close and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "What are you gonna do?" "Hit me." The man's hand trembled. Not with anger, with fear. He looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would say something. Nothing. Then, from somewhere behind the crowd, a calm voice cut through the noise. "That's enough." Not loud. Not angry. Just steady. The teenagers turned their heads. The man with the cane did too. A stranger was standing a few steps away, relaxed, unhurried. No phone in his hand. No rush in his movements. Just watching. One of the teens laughed. "Who asked you?" The stranger didn't answer immediately. He simply took one step forward. And in that moment, something changed. The laughter faded. The air felt heavier. No one knew why. Not yet. What happens next changes everything. The man with the cane didn't always walk like this. There was a time when he moved quickly. When stairs didn't feel like mountains. When crossing the street didn't require planning every step in advance. That time ended years ago. An accident. One moment of bad luck that rewrote everything. Doctors used careful words. Permanent damage. Limited mobility. You'll need support. What they didn't talk about was the silence that followed. The looks. The way people suddenly saw him as slow. Or invisible. Every morning, he followed the same routine. He woke up early because moving slowly meant needing more time. He hated being late, not because it mattered, but because it made people stare. He chose paths with benches. Routes with fewer stairs. Places where crowds didn't rush. Not because he wanted comfort, but because he wanted dignity. That day was no different. He had gone out for something simple. Something ordinary. He never expected to become entertainment. When the teenagers surrounded him, his first instinct wasn't fear. It was embarrassment. He thought of the people watching. Strangers. Witnesses. He hoped someone would step in. No one did. That wasn't new. He had learned a painful truth over the years. People don't always ignore cruelty because they agree with it. Sometimes they ignore it because they're afraid. Afraid of involvement. Afraid of being next. He had been there before. Different faces. Same outcome. He lowered his eyes, not because he was weak, but because he didn't want to provoke them. He knew what his body could no longer do. Running wasn't an option. Fighting was impossible. All he had left was his voice. "Please," he said. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just honestly. The word hung in the air, fragile, exposed. And then it was crushed by laughter. That was the moment something inside him sank. Not hope. Expectation. Because when you live long enough with limitations, you stop expecting rescue. You just hope for mercy. Back in the present, his grip tightened around the cane. Not as a weapon. As balance. As reassurance. He noticed the phone camera again. The way the lens stayed fixed on him. This wasn't just humiliation anymore. It was permanent. Something to be replayed, shared, mocked. His breathing slowed, not from calm, but from control. He reminded himself to stay upright, to stay composed, to stay human. A sudden shove broke his balance. His knee buckled. For a split second, he thought he would fall. The crowd gasped, softly, as if reacting to a movie scene, not a real man losing control of his body. He caught himself just in time. No applause. No relief. Just disappointment from the ones hoping for something worse. That's when he noticed the stranger again. Still standing there. Still watching. Not recording. Not shouting. Just present. Their eyes met for a brief moment. And in that look, the man with the cane felt something unfamiliar. Not protection. Not rescue. But acknowledgement. As if someone finally saw him. Not as weak. Not as broken. But as someone worth stopping for. And somewhere deep inside the circle, the teenagers sensed it too. Because the laughter didn't sound as confident anymore. And the silence was starting to feel different. Be honest for a moment. If you saw 5 teenagers surrounding a disabled man like this, would you step in, or would you keep walking? The laughter didn't stop. It changed. At first, it had been careless, loud, playful, reckless. Now it was sharper. More focused. The teenagers felt it, that subtle shift in control. They had gone too far to back down quietly. One of them circled the man slowly, dragging his feet across the pavement. "So what's your story?" he asked. "War hero? Accident? Or were you just born broken?" The words landed harder than the shove. The man with the cane swallowed. He didn't answer. Silence, to them, sounded like permission. Another teen stepped forward, pointing at the cane. "That thing won't help you," he said. "You drop it. You drop." A few people in the crowd shifted again. Someone muttered, "Hey, chill." But it was weak. Barely audible. The teenagers ignored it. One of them raised his phone higher, angling it carefully. "Say something," he urged. "People love this stuff." The man looked at the phone, really looked at it this time. He understood what it meant. This wasn't just happening to him anymore. It was being saved, stored, turned into content. His hands trembled again, but he forced them still. "Please," he said, louder now. "I haven't done anything to you." The words echoed, and then dissolved. One teen smirked. "That's the problem," he said. "You don't do anything." The circle tightened. Someone kicked the cane lightly, not enough to knock it away. Just enough to test how much balance he really had. The man staggered. A sharp breath escaped the crowd. This time, the silence felt heavier, guilty. Because everyone knew what they were watching. And still, no one moved. Across the street, the observer remained where he was. Hands relaxed at his sides. Posture steady. He had noticed something the others hadn't. The way the teenagers kept glancing at each other. The way they were feeding off reactions, not courage, but momentum. This wasn't confidence. It was escalation. Back inside the circle, one teen stepped too close. Close enough that the man could smell alcohol on his breath. "What happens?" the teen whispered. "If I take that cane?" The man's heart pounded. He imagined the ground rushing up. The helplessness. The laughter. He tightened his grip. "Don't," he said. Just one word. But it was firm. For a moment, just a moment, the teenager hesitated. Then someone behind him laughed. "Look at him," a voice said. "He thinks he's in charge." That hesitation vanished. The teen reached out. His fingers brushed the cane. Time slowed. The man's balance shifted. His muscles tensed, instinct fighting reality. Across the street, the observer took one step forward. Not rushed. Not dramatic. But deliberate. The sound of a foot touching pavement cut through the noise. The teenagers noticed. Not all at once. But enough. One of them glanced over his shoulder. "Who's that?" he muttered. The man with the cane felt the pressure ease slightly. Not because the danger was gone, but because it was no longer invisible. The cane was yanked halfway out of his hand. He stumbled. A woman in the crowd gasped loudly this time. "Hey!" someone finally shouted. Too late. The man dropped to one knee, catching himself with one hand. Pain shot up his leg. The teenagers froze, surprised by the reaction they had caused. This wasn't funny anymore. This was real. The observer's voice carried again. Calm, controlled. Step back. Not shouted. Spoken like a fact. One teen laughed nervously. "You his dad or something?" No answer. The observer stepped closer. Now the distance was gone. The circle wasn't complete anymore. The man with the cane looked up. He saw the stranger clearly now. Older. Calm. Unshaken. No anger in his face. No fear either. Just certainty. The teenagers felt it too. Their jokes faded. Their movements slowed. The phone lowered slightly. Something had changed, and none of them could explain why. The observer stopped just outside the circle. He looked at the teenagers, each of them, one by one. Then he spoke. "Last chance." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Because suddenly, everyone understood. Whatever happened next would not be a joke. The air felt different now. Not louder. Not calmer. Heavier. The teenagers stood frozen, unsure of what had just changed, only that something had. The man who had stepped forward didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten them. He didn't even look angry. He simply stood there. Still. Balanced. Unmoving. The teenager closest to him tried to laugh it off. "Relax," he said, forcing a grin. "We're just messing around." No one laughed with him. The observer's eyes didn't leave his. "You pushed him," the man said calmly. It wasn't a question. It was an observation. One of the teens scoffed. "So what?" The man shifted his weight slightly, not forward, not backward. Just enough. That small movement drew attention to something no one had noticed before. His posture. Relaxed, but ready. Like someone who didn't need to rush. "Pick up the cane," the man said. The words landed softly. The teenager blinked. "What?" "I said," the man repeated evenly. "Pick up the cane." For a moment, nobody moved. The cane lay on the ground between them. A thin line separating humiliation from dignity. The teenagers looked at each other. One of them muttered, "Why should we listen to you?" The man didn't answer right away. He looked past them, at the small crowd that had gathered. At the faces. The phones. The hesitation. Then he looked back. "Because this ends now," he said. Still calm. Still controlled. One teen bent down and grabbed the cane, tossing it back toward the disabled man's feet. "There," he said. "Happy." The man with the cane reached for it slowly, his hands shaking. Not with fear, but with pain. The observer noticed. "You okay?" he asked quietly. The disabled man nodded, though it was clear he wasn't. The teenagers shifted again. They didn't like this. They were no longer the center of attention. They were being watched, judged. One of them stepped forward, chest puffed out. "You think you're some kind of hero," he said. "You got a problem with us?" The observer finally exhaled. A slow breath. "No," he said. "I have a problem with bullies." That word hit harder than any insult. The crowd reacted, murmurs spreading quickly now. The teenager's confidence cracked, just a little. One of them whispered, "Let's go." Another shook his head. "No way. He's nobody." The observer tilted his head slightly. "Walk away," he said. There was no threat in his voice. But there was finality. One teenager laughed, sharp and forced. "Or what?" For the first time, the observer moved closer. Not fast. Not aggressive. Just close enough that the teenager instinctively stepped back. That's when they noticed it. The stillness. The way his hands hung loosely at his sides. Fingers relaxed, not clenched. The way his eyes didn't dart or blink too much. This wasn't hesitation. This was control. "You don't want to find out," the man said quietly. The words weren't dramatic. They didn't need to be. Because something primal had shifted. The teenagers weren't testing him anymore. They were measuring risk. One of them swallowed hard. "Bro," he muttered. "This guy's serious." The phone lowered completely now. The crowd leaned in. Everyone felt it. The moment before something irreversible. The observer turned slightly, just enough to block the disabled man from view. A subtle move. Protective. Deliberate. "Last warning," he said. No countdown. No raised voice. Just certainty. The teenagers hesitated. Seconds stretched. Then, footsteps. One teen stepped back. Then another. The circle broke. Not because they were told to leave, but because staying suddenly felt dangerous. The observer didn't chase them. Didn't insult them. Didn't look back. He simply turned to the man with the cane. "You should sit down," he said gently. The disabled man nodded, overwhelmed. As he lowered himself onto a nearby bench, the observer stood beside him. Silent again. Watching. Waiting. And somewhere deep inside the teenagers' minds, a thought lingered, cold and unsettling. They had almost crossed a line. And they had no idea how badly that could have ended. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The teenagers stood several steps back now, no longer loud, no longer joking. They hadn't run. But they hadn't stayed either. They hovered in that uncertain space between pride and fear. The man with the cane sat on the bench, breathing carefully, his hands resting on his knees. Pain pulsed through his leg, but he said nothing. The stranger remained standing beside him. Still calm. Still silent. One of the teenagers finally broke it. "You think you won something," he said, trying to sound confident. "You just embarrassed us in front of everyone." The stranger turned his head slightly. "No," he said. "You embarrassed yourselves." The words landed clean, no insult, no heat. Just truth. The teen scoffed, but his voice cracked. "You don't even know who we are." The stranger looked at him, really looked at him, and then shook his head. "And I don't need to." Something about that response unsettled them more than anger ever could. The crowd was no longer pretending this wasn't happening. Phones were still raised, but now they were aimed at the stranger. Someone whispered, "He looks familiar." Another voice replied, "Yeah, I was thinking the same thing." The teenagers noticed. One of them glanced back at the crowd, then at the stranger. "What?" he snapped. "What are you all staring at?" No one answered him. The stranger crouched slightly, bringing himself to eye level with the man on the bench. "You okay to stand?" he asked quietly. The man nodded. "I think so." The stranger offered his arm, not dramatic, not heroic. Just respectful. The man took it and slowly stood. That's when the angle changed. The light caught the stranger's face fully for the first time. A clear view. The murmurs grew louder. A woman near the front of the crowd gasped. "Oh my God!" A man whispered, "No way!" The teenagers turned back again, confused now. "What?" one of them said. "What is it?" The whisper turned into a realization, spreading quickly, almost nervously. "That's him," someone said. "That's actually him." One of the teens laughed, sharp and defensive. "Who?" The stranger straightened, his posture relaxed but unmistakably commanding. The crowd answered before he could. "That's Steven Seagal." Silence. Real silence. The kind that drains the air from a space. The teenagers stared at him. One of them blinked hard. No, that's not." Another teen pulled out his phone and typed frantically. Then his face went pale. "It's him," he whispered. "It's actually him." The realization hit like a delayed shockwave. This wasn't just a stranger anymore. This wasn't just someone who stepped in. This was someone they had seen on screens. Someone known for calm and consequences. Steven Seagal didn't react to the recognition. Didn't smile. Didn't acknowledge it. He simply turned back to the teenagers. "Walk away," he said again. This time, no one laughed. One of the teens swallowed hard. "We didn't know," he muttered. Steven Seagal met his eyes. "That doesn't change what you did." The words weren't cruel. They were final. The teenagers stepped back further now. Hands visible, voices low. "We're leaving," one of them said quickly. They didn't wait for permission. They turned and walked, fast, but not running. The crowd parted for them instinctively. No cheers followed. No insults. Just quiet judgment. Steven Seagal watched until they disappeared. Then he turned back to the man with the cane. "You're safe now," he said. The man nodded, overwhelmed. "Thank you," he whispered. Steven Seagal gave a small nod in return. Nothing more. The crowd slowly began to disperse. But something had changed. People weren't just walking away. They were thinking. Because they hadn't just witnessed a confrontation. They had witnessed restraint. And the most unsettling part wasn't who stepped in. It was realizing how easily they could have missed him. If you saw him standing there, calm, quiet, unassuming, would you have recognized him before it was too late? The teenagers had taken only a few steps when it happened. One of them stopped. Maybe it was pride. Maybe embarrassment. Maybe the need to save face. He turned around. "You think this is over?" he said, louder than before. His voice echoed just enough to pull attention back. The crowd froze again. Steven Seagal didn't move. He didn't sigh. He didn't shake his head. He simply turned. Slowly. The teenager took a step forward, pointing. "You didn't touch us," he said. "You didn't do anything." Steven Seagal looked at him for a long moment. Then he spoke. "You're right," he said. "I didn't." The teenager smirked. "So stop acting like." In a single motion, smooth, almost casual, Steven Seagal stepped forward. Not fast. Precise. The teenager barely had time to react before his wrist was caught. Not yanked, not twisted violently. Just controlled. Steven Seagal turned the wrist slightly. The smirk vanished. A sharp gasp escaped the teenager's mouth as his knees bent instinctively. Pain, sudden and undeniable, shot through his arm. "Don't," Steven Seagal said calmly. "Fight it." The words weren't a threat. They were advice. The teenager froze, confused by the calmness, the certainty. Steven Seagal adjusted his grip, guiding the arm downward with effortless control. No strike. No punch. Just physics. The teenager found himself on one knee, then both. The crowd inhaled as one. Steven Seagal released him immediately. The teenager collapsed backward, clutching his wrist, stunned more than hurt. No blood. No chaos. Just shock. The other teenagers backed away instantly now. Hands raised. "Hey, hey," one of them said. "We're done. We're done." Steven Seagal stepped back as well, creating distance. Control again. He looked at the teenager on the ground. "You okay?" he asked. The question caught everyone off guard. The teen nodded quickly, wide-eyed. "Why, yeah." Steven Seagal offered no hand. No lecture. He simply turned away. That moment, more than the move itself, broke something. The teenagers weren't afraid of being beaten. They were afraid of how easily it had happened. How little effort it took. How quickly arrogance had turned into helplessness. One of them whispered, "Let's go." No. They didn't argue this time. They walked away, fast, silent, shaken. The crowd remained frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. Steven Seagal returned to the bench where the man with the cane sat. "You all right?" he asked again. The man nodded, eyes still fixed on where the teenagers had been. "I've never seen anything like that," he said quietly. Steven Seagal gave a small shrug. "Most fights end before they start," he replied. "People just don't know how to stop." He crouched down slightly, checking the man's knee. "You should get that looked at," he said. "Pain like that shouldn't be ignored." The man smiled weakly. "I'll be fine," he said. "Thank you for standing up." Steven Seagal nodded once. That's what people should do, he said. Stand up. Around them, people finally began to move. Phones lowered. Whispers spread, not excitement, but reflection. No one cheered. No one clapped. It didn't feel like a performance. It felt like a lesson. One man in the crowd spoke up. You could have hurt him, he said quietly. Steven Seagal looked at him. I didn't need to, he replied. That answer lingered, because it said everything. The man with the cane slowly stood again, using the bench for support. Steven Seagal stayed close, not hovering, not guiding. Just present. As they walked a few steps together, the crowd parted instinctively. Not out of fear. Out of respect. Behind them, the space where the confrontation had happened felt empty now. Like something had been removed. Not violence. Ignorance. And for the first time since it began, the man with the cane didn't feel small. He felt seen. The street slowly returned to normal. Cars passed. Voices resumed. Footsteps scattered in different directions. But something had shifted. Not in the air. In the people. The man with the cane stood quietly for a moment, adjusting his grip. His breathing had steadied. The fear in his eyes was gone, replaced by something softer. Relief. You didn't have to do that, he said gently. Standing beside him, Steven Seagal shook his head slightly. Yes, he replied. I did. There was no pride in his voice. No performance. Just conviction. The crowd had thinned now, but a few people still lingered, watching from a respectful distance. One woman stepped forward. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I should have said something. The man with the cane looked at her and offered a small smile. It's all right, he said. And somehow, he meant it. Because sometimes forgiveness is stronger than confrontation. Steven Seagal glanced around at the remaining bystanders. You don't need to be a fighter, he said calmly. But you do need to choose a side. The words weren't loud, but they carried. The woman nodded slowly. So did a few others. The lesson had landed. Not because of force, but because of restraint. The man with the cane adjusted his jacket and prepared to leave. Can I ask you something? He said. Steven Seagal looked at him. Why did you step in? A brief pause. Then, because someone should have. No dramatic music. No applause. Just truth. They walked a few steps together before stopping at the corner. I'll manage from here, the man said. Steven Seagal gave a single nod. Take care. And just like that, he turned and walked away. No crowd following him. No cameras chasing him. Just a man disappearing into the ordinary rhythm of the street. But the people who witnessed it would not forget. Not the teenagers, who learned how quickly power can shift. Not the crowd, who learned how silence can feel like participation. And not the man with the cane, who learned that dignity can be defended. The street looked the same. But the moment would stay with them. Because strength isn't always loud. It doesn't shout. It doesn't boast. Sometimes, it just stands there. Calm. Unshaken. Certain. And that's what makes it powerful. Speech balloon final engagement. Now let me ask you something. If you were standing there, and you saw what was happening, would you step in, or would you look away? Be honest. Write your answer in the comments. Yes, I would step in. No, I would walk away. There's no judgment here. Just reflection. If this story made you think, if it reminded you that quiet strength matters, if you believe more people should stand up for those who can't, then take 1 second to like this video. It helps more than you think. And if you enjoy powerful real-life inspired stories like this, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next story might challenge you even more. Strength isn't about violence. It's about control. And sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove it.